Well, that's right. The leaders of this team say what they've found is very exciting and very convincing.
They vanished without a single trace. Over 100 men, women, and children. Gone. No bodies, no graves, no signs of a struggle. Just one chilling clue carved into a wooden post. CROATOAN.
La plupart des Américains connaissent bien la présence anglaise précoce dans l'est des États-Unis, notamment à Roanoke Colony, Jamestown et Pilgrim's Landing à Plymouth Rock. Dès le CE1, CE2, c'est ce que nous apprenions sur l'histoire américaine.
For more than 400 years, the fate of the Lost Colony of Roanoke has baffled historians, scientists, and treasure hunters alike. Was it murder, survival, or something far stranger? What really happened on that island? The truth may not be what you expect, and the answers might be hidden in plain sight. The story begins in the late 1500s, a time when England was eager to compete with Spain, which had already claimed vast areas of the Americas. Queen Elizabeth I, determined to secure England's own foothold in the New World, gave Sir Walter Raleigh permission to explore and establish a colony. Raleigh didn't lead the mission himself, but he sponsored it, and the task of establishing this English settlement fell to others. Roanoke Island, located just off the present-day coast of North Carolina, was chosen as the site for this first attempt. In 1585, Raleigh sent a group of about 100 men to explore and settle the area. The mission was led by Ralph Lane and included scientists, soldiers, and artists. Among them was John White, an artist and mapmaker whose detailed drawings of the land and its people would later become important historical records. This first colony didn't last long. The settlers quickly ran into trouble. The environment was harsh, and the group was ill-prepared for life in unfamiliar territory. Crops failed, relationships with local Native American tribes grew tense, and morale declined. After less than a year, the colony was abandoned. The men returned to England in 1586 with Sir Francis Drake, who had stopped by after a privateering raid and offered them a way home. Despite the failure, Raleigh and others in England remained determined. 2 years later, in 1587, another group set out, this time with a different plan. Instead of sending just soldiers and tradesmen, this second group was made up of entire families. It included around 115 settlers, including women and children. The idea was to establish a permanent English town in the New World, rather than a temporary outpost. John White, who had returned from the previous voyage, was appointed governor of the new colony. He accepted the role with a sense of purpose and optimism, especially as this journey would also involve his own family. White's daughter, Eleanor Dare, was one of the settlers. She was pregnant when the group set out. Not long after their arrival, she gave birth to a baby girl named Virginia Dare, the first English child born on American soil. This personal connection made John White's mission even more significant. He wasn't just leading a colony, he was also looking after his own family's future in a strange and distant land. However, from the beginning, things didn't go according to plan. The settlers were originally meant to land near the Chesapeake Bay, where the land was believed to be more fertile and better suited for farming. But for reasons still debated today, possibly bad weather, navigational issues, or disagreements with the ship's captain, the settlers were dropped off at Roanoke Island instead. The choice to settle there would prove to be a critical turning point. The island was densely wooded and had poor soil, which made growing crops difficult. The settlers were also running low on supplies from the start. While some Native American tribes in the area had once been friendly with the English, past experiences had strained those relationships. The earlier 1585 expedition had led to conflict and violence in some cases. Although not all the tribes were openly hostile, there was a noticeable level of tension. Conditions deteriorated quickly. Crops failed again. Food was scarce. Hunting didn't bring in enough to feed the colony. Disease may have played a role too, as settlers faced illness and a lack of medical knowledge. Their new life in America, once full of promise, had turned into a daily struggle for survival. Many began to fear that they wouldn't last long without outside help. Faced with this desperate situation, John White made a difficult decision. Just a few months after landing, he agreed to return to England to gather more supplies and reinforcements. Leaving the colony behind, including his daughter and newborn granddaughter, was not something he took lightly. He promised to return quickly, understanding that time was of the essence. White's journey back to England was difficult, and once he arrived, events beyond his control made returning impossible. England was under threat from Spain, and the Spanish Armada was preparing to invade. Every available ship was needed to defend the country. White pleaded with officials for a way back, tried to arrange passage on private vessels, and even appealed directly to the Queen. But it was no use. The war had become the nation's top priority, and White's personal mission had to wait. It wasn't until 1590, 3 years later, that John White finally secured passage back to Roanoke. By then, any hope of a quick resupply mission had long faded. The settlers, if they had survived, had been on their own for far too long. White's return to the colony would not bring relief, but rather the beginning of a mystery that would last for centuries. When White arrived at Roanoke Island, he found the settlement abandoned. There were no people in sight, no fires burning, no signs of recent life. Homes had been taken apart carefully, not destroyed, and the entire colony looked as if it had been intentionally dismantled. This wasn't the aftermath of a battle. It looked more like people had left in an orderly way. But where had they gone? The only clue was a word carved into a wooden post: CROATOAN. Nearby, the letters CRO had been carved into a tree. Before White had left 3 years earlier, he had told the settlers to carve a cross into a tree if they were forced to leave under threat. There was no cross. That gave him some hope that the settlers had moved peacefully, perhaps to CROATOAN Island, now known as Hatteras Island, about 50 miles south, where a friendly tribe once lived. White wanted to search the island immediately, but once again, bad luck struck. A powerful storm rolled in, and the captain of his ship refused to continue the search. Supplies were low, and the crew was anxious to return to England. Reluctantly, White left without ever finding the settlers or confirming where they had gone. He never saw his family again. That unanswered question, what happened to the people of the Roanoke colony, has captured imaginations for centuries. It sparked rumors, legends, and endless investigations. Over time, many theories emerged. Some say the settlers were killed by hostile tribes. Others believe they moved inland or were taken in by friendly native communities. The word CROATOAN has become one of the most iconic and mysterious clues in American history. When John White finally returned to Roanoke Island in 1590, he was not just a governor or an explorer. He was a father and a grandfather. The emotional weight of the journey back to the New World was immense. For 3 long years, he had been stuck in England, unable to fulfill the promise he made to his daughter Eleanor and the other colonists. The Spanish Armada and the resulting military demands had prevented any ship from taking him across the Atlantic. Now, after all that time, he was finally back, hopeful, anxious, and desperate for answers. But the moment White stepped ashore, it was clear something was wrong. The place he had left behind was no longer recognizable. He had expected to see signs of life, people working, smoke rising from chimneys, children playing, maybe even his granddaughter Virginia Dare walking or being carried through the settlement. Instead, there was silence. No voices, no movement, no welcoming party. As he and his small crew moved further into the site, the mystery deepened. The houses that had once stood there were gone, taken apart piece by piece. There were no signs of fire or destruction, no charred wood or blackened remains. The buildings hadn't been destroyed in a raid or storm. They had simply been dismantled, almost as if the settlers had carefully taken their homes apart before leaving. The fort, once the central point of protection for the settlers, had also disappeared. It was clear this wasn't the result of sudden panic. It looked methodical. Someone had taken their time. There were no human remains, no graves, and no scattered belongings left behind. Not a single sign indicated any sort of violent confrontation or hasty evacuation. It didn't look like the settlers had been attacked, and there wasn't the kind of disorder you'd expect if they had fled quickly. In many ways, the calmness of the scene made it more unsettling. It was as if the entire colony had just walked away. Then the search party came across something. Carved into a sturdy wooden post was a word: CROATOAN. A few steps away, the letters CRO were etched into a nearby tree. These weren't random markings. White had made specific arrangements before leaving the colony years earlier. He had instructed the settlers that if they had to move, they should leave behind a message telling where they had gone. If they had been forced to leave under duress or danger, they were to carve a cross into a tree. White looked closely. There was no cross. That gave him hope. Maybe the settlers had left of their own free will. Maybe they had gone to CROATOAN Island, a place about 50 miles south, now known as Hatteras Island. The CROATOAN people were a Native American tribe that had, at times, shown friendliness toward the English. During the earlier expeditions, they had traded and communicated peacefully. It was possible the settlers had gone to live with them. That, at least, would explain the lack of violence and the disappearance of the entire group. White was eager to follow the clue. If his daughter and granddaughter were alive, they might be waiting on CROATOAN Island. He begged the ship's captain to continue the journey and head south. But nature had other plans. A massive storm was approaching. The crew, already worn out and running low on supplies, refused to press on. The risk of shipwreck or being stranded was too great. With no support and no other options, White was forced to abandon the search. It was a crushing moment. After all the effort to return, after years of waiting, pleading, and hoping, he was leaving again, empty-handed. He never found his daughter. He never saw his granddaughter. And he never learned the fate of the colony he had once led. That was the last recorded attempt John White made to find them. He returned to England and faded into history, carrying unanswered questions that would remain unresolved for generations. The disappearance of the Roanoke colony became more than just a personal tragedy. It grew into a national mystery. The word CROATOAN, carved into wood, became a symbol of the unknown. What had happened to over 100 settlers, including women and children? How could they vanish so completely? Over the years, the lack of evidence only deepened the mystery. There were no written messages, no maps left behind, and no stories that made it back to England. The disappearance wasn't just sudden, it was total. The site showed signs of deliberate abandonment, but beyond that, there was nothing to go on. What made the situation even more puzzling was the fact that some aspects of the colony's disappearance didn't align with how such events usually unfold. If the settlers had died from disease or starvation, there would have been graves or remains. If they had been attacked, some traces of violence should have been found. Broken weapons, defensive positions, or bloodstains. But there was none of that. The quiet nature of their departure, along with the carved word, led some to believe that the settlers had integrated with the CROATOAN people. This theory wasn't just based on guesswork. It was supported by early records from explorers who came to the region in later years. Some of them reported encounters with Native American tribes who spoke broken English or had lighter skin and eye colors uncommon among indigenous groups. These reports were vague and scattered, but they added fuel to the idea that the settlers hadn't died. They had assimilated. Still, without hard evidence, the disappearance of the Roanoke settlers remained unsolved. It was one of the first major historical mysteries of the New World, and remains one of the most talked about today. The story was passed down for centuries, becoming the subject of books, articles, documentaries, and speculation. What makes the story so compelling is not just the mystery itself, but the emotional stakes involved. These weren't just nameless explorers. They were families. They brought hopes of a new life, building homes, raising children, and creating a future in a land far from their own. They risked everything for the chance at a better life, only to vanish without explanation. John White's experience underscores the tragedy. He left behind people he loved and returned to find their world gone. He had given everything to the mission, his time, his reputation, his family, and came back to a silence that offered no closure. Modern historians continue to study this case, hoping to uncover new clues. Over time, archaeological work and scientific research have offered some promising leads. But even today, there is no definitive answer to the question of what happened to the Roanoke settlers. The carving of CROATOAN remains one of the only clues ever found. What began as England's attempt to plant its roots in the New World ended in silence. The colony's disappearance shaped future settlement efforts, particularly at Jamestown, where the lessons of Roanoke were not forgotten. There, English settlers took more precautions and made different choices. Some learned the hard way from the quiet failure of Roanoke. The mystery left behind in 1590 set the stage for centuries of curiosity. It continues to invite investigation and interpretation, sparking everything from academic research to wild theories. Whether the settlers found safety, met a tragic end, or quietly adapted to a new way of life, the one thing we know is that they were never heard from again. The Lost Colony of Roanoke became more than just a historical footnote. It became a symbol of the unknown, of questions left unanswered, and of how history sometimes leaves behind silence where stories once were. In the centuries that followed the disappearance of the Roanoke settlers, people have searched for answers in every possible place. From dusty historical records to local folklore, from linguistic oddities to personal journals, the hunt for clues has never really stopped. But some of the most intriguing leads have come not from written documents or stories, but from the ground itself. Roanoke Island and the surrounding coastal areas have drawn the attention of archaeologists for decades. It's the only place where the lost colony was known to have lived, even briefly, and many believed that if the truth was buried anywhere, it was there, just waiting to be uncovered. However, like so much else in this story, the results of the digs have been both fascinating and frustrating. Early attempts to find physical evidence of the colony's fate began in the 1800s and early 1900s. These early efforts were mostly carried out by amateurs and local enthusiasts, hoping to stumble across a major discovery. Their tools were basic, and their methods lacked the precision that modern archaeology demands. But the passion was there. Unfortunately, these early digs produced little more than a few scattered artifacts, and none offered real answers. It wasn't until the mid to late 20th century that proper, systematic archaeological work began on Roanoke Island. Teams of trained experts began examining the area, using scientific methods to locate what they believed might be the original site of the 1587 settlement. They did find signs that the English had been there: pieces of pottery, iron tools, and other remnants that matched what would have been used in the late 16th century. However, there was a problem. For a settlement meant to house over 100 people, the amount of material uncovered was surprisingly small. There wasn't enough to suggest a bustling colony that had been occupied for long. Some archaeologists began to suspect that the colony may not have lasted very long at all before something caused the settlers to move on. Whether that something was starvation, conflict, or simply a lack of viable resources is still up for debate. Attention gradually shifted away from Roanoke Island itself. The biggest clue left behind, the word CROATOAN, pointed south to Hatteras Island, which was known in the 16th century as CROATOAN. This new focus opened up fresh possibilities. What if the settlers had left Roanoke and gone to live with the CROATOAN tribe? Archaeologists began to investigate. The Lost Colony Center for Science and Research, along with the First Colony Foundation, took the lead on modern digs in this area. Their work on Hatteras Island uncovered several items that added weight to the idea that the English had at some point lived there, or at least spent time there. Among the finds were parts of a rapier sword, a slate writing tablet, and fragments of European pottery, all dating to the correct time period. What made these discoveries especially interesting was the way the artifacts were found. They were not isolated. Mixed in with these English items were Native American tools, pottery, and other materials. The layers weren't neatly separated, as if one group had moved in after the other. Instead, they were intertwined, suggesting that the two groups had lived together, or at least interacted closely over a period of time. Pottery, while seemingly mundane, has proven to be a valuable clue in this mystery. Each culture makes pottery in its own way, and archaeologists can often identify a community or time period based on how ceramics are made and decorated. The fragments found on Hatteras Island showed a blend of English manufacturing and Native American styles. This kind of cultural blending supports the theory that the settlers may have joined the CROATOAN tribe, not just as guests, but possibly as members of a shared or newly formed community. But the evidence isn't confined to the coast. In recent decades, researchers have expanded their search to inland areas of North Carolina. This idea came from the thought that the settlers may have split up. Some could have gone to Hatteras Island, while others may have traveled inland, searching for better farmland or safer living conditions. In these areas, too, intriguing discoveries have been made. In Bertie County, along the Chowan River, a location dubbed Site X became the focus of interest in 2012. This wasn't a random guess. researchers had been examining one of John White's original maps of the region, held by the British Museum. Using advanced imaging technology, they found a small fort symbol hidden beneath a patch on the map. That tiny detail suggested that White may have marked a secondary site, perhaps a backup plan or a place where the settlers were supposed to go if Roanoke failed. When teams began excavating the area, they discovered European-style pottery and other materials that dated back to the late 1500s. While the amount of evidence found wasn't enough to prove a large colony had lived there, it was significant. These items included parts of iron tools and pieces of ceramic similar to what had been used in England. As with the Hatteras finds, Native American artifacts were also present in the same layers of soil. This mix of English and Native American items found together in multiple locations adds depth to a theory that has slowly gained traction over the years, that the settlers didn't vanish all at once. Instead, they may have split into smaller groups and gone in different directions, forming new lives by joining local tribes. They may have adapted to their environment, integrating into native communities where they could access food, protection, and knowledge of the land. One of the biggest challenges in finding definitive answers is the way history leaves clues. Artifacts degrade, buildings rot, oral traditions shift over time. A community that blends into another may leave behind very few clear signs. And when those clues are found, they often raise more questions than they answer. Still, the findings at Hatteras Island and Site X provide more than just fragments of metal and clay. They tell a story. Not a complete one, but a story of survival, of movement, and perhaps even cooperation between two cultures. They show that the settlers may not have simply died out, but instead found ways to live, just not in the way England had planned. Importantly, the layering of artifacts at these sites suggests long-term occupation. If the settlers had only passed through, we would expect to find English items at a single level, representing a brief visit. But when these items are mixed with native materials across various layers, it implies they stayed, possibly for years, possibly even for generations. And yet, even with these encouraging discoveries, there is no single piece of evidence that confirms the entire story. No document says outright what happened. No graves have been found that contain the remains of colonists with identifiable European DNA. And that makes it difficult to declare the mystery solved. But modern archaeology doesn't always provide sudden revelations. Often, it's about slow, careful progress, piecing together a puzzle that has been scattered by time. What we can say with growing confidence is that the Roanoke settlers likely didn't disappear into thin air. The clues left behind, on Roanoke Island, on Hatteras, and in inland North Carolina, point to a more complex ending. An ending that involves adaptation, cooperation, and quiet survival. It may not be dramatic, but it is deeply human. While archaeological digs have provided some valuable clues about what may have happened to the Roanoke settlers, they are only one piece of the puzzle. To get a fuller picture, researchers have also turned to another type of evidence: historical records and oral traditions. These sources don't offer hard physical proof, but they reveal patterns, stories, and observations passed down over generations. When combined with what's been found in the ground, they add depth to the idea that the settlers didn't simply vanish, but instead merged into local communities, slowly slipping out of sight from the written record. One of the earliest pieces of written evidence that points toward this possibility comes from John Lawson, an English explorer who visited the Carolina region in the early 1700s, more than 100 years after the Roanoke colony disappeared. While traveling through the area, Lawson spent time with the Hatteras people, who were believed to be descendants of the CROATOAN tribe. He made a curious observation that would go on to shape theories for centuries. Lawson wrote that some of the Hatteras people had gray or blue eyes, which was very unusual among Native American populations at the time. He also noted that some of them had facial features that seemed distinctly European. According to what the tribe told him, some of their ancestors had been white people who could talk in a book, a reference to reading and writing, skills they would not have picked up through trade alone. This wasn't the only report suggesting a possible blending of cultures. Around the same time, William Strachey, who served as secretary of the Jamestown colony, recorded similar stories. He described inland native groups that wore European-style clothing and even lived in two-story stone houses. which was not typical of indigenous architecture. Strachey didn't see these communities firsthand, but he reported the accounts as credible, having heard them from other colonists and local tribes. He too believed that survivors from the Roanoke colony might have been taken in by native groups or possibly integrated by choice. For a long time, these reports were treated as interesting but not especially reliable. Oral traditions, after all, are difficult to verify. They change over time. Stories are shaped by memory, personal interpretation, and cultural values. But the fact that multiple explorers across different time periods reported similar details suggests that these stories may contain some truth. In more recent years, interest in these oral accounts has grown, particularly among researchers studying Native American communities in North Carolina. One group in particular, the Lumbee tribe, has long claimed descent from the Roanoke settlers. For generations, Lumbee oral tradition has included stories about white ancestors who joined their people, and the tribe has held on to this connection as a meaningful part of their identity. Some of the most intriguing support for the Lumbee claim comes from the surnames passed down through the tribe. Several names found in modern Lumbee families also appear on the list of the original Roanoke colonists. It could be coincidence, but given the small number of names and the limited population at the time, many researchers believe it deserves attention. The Lumbee also speak a form of English that includes words and patterns not commonly found elsewhere. Linguists studying the tribe's speech patterns have pointed out similarities to older forms of English, although language evolves so much over time that this kind of evidence can be difficult to measure accurately. Still, when combined with family names, oral stories, and physical traits, it forms a pattern that's hard to ignore. Cultural traditions offer further hints. Some tribes that are believed to have historical connections to the Roanoke settlers have shown spiritual practices or social customs that seem to blend Native American and European influences. This includes how communities were organized, the types of tools they used, and even how they built certain structures. None of these details, taken alone, prove anything definitive. But together, they paint a picture of contact and cooperation, of two cultures coming together in ways that went beyond simple trade or occasional encounters. Even so, caution is necessary. Oral traditions are powerful, but they are not always consistent or provable. Memories passed down over hundreds of years are bound to evolve. Stories can be reshaped to serve modern needs or identities. In some cases, links may be imagined rather than inherited. That said, oral history remains a vital part of how many Native communities preserve their past. These stories are treated not as vague legends, but as vital parts of community knowledge passed down with care. Modern science has also entered the conversation. Researchers in fields like genetics and climate science have added new layers to the Roanoke mystery, some of which seem to support the theory of gradual integration into native populations. One of the most notable scientific efforts involves the study of tree rings, a field known as dendrochronology. In the early 2000s, scientists examined the rings of ancient bald cypress trees found near the Roanoke area. Tree rings can reveal patterns of rainfall and drought across centuries. What they discovered was striking. During the exact period when the Roanoke settlers would have been trying to establish their colony, the region experienced a severe, prolonged drought. This drought would have made farming incredibly difficult. Fresh water would have been scarce. For a group already facing tension with some local tribes, limited supplies, and harsh conditions, this environmental stress could have pushed them to a breaking point. If survival at Roanoke was no longer possible, seeking help from friendly tribes, such as the CROATOANs, would have been a logical move. Genetic research has also tried to shed light on the settlers' fate. Some DNA studies have been conducted on modern-day members of tribes like the Lumbee and Hatteras descendants, looking for traces of European ancestry that might connect them to the Roanoke colonists. These efforts have revealed small amounts of European genetic markers in some populations, suggesting there may have been some level of intermarriage or integration centuries ago. However, there are significant limitations. The passage of time makes it difficult to isolate DNA specifically tied to the Roanoke settlers. Many Native American communities have mixed ancestry due to years of contact, colonization, and migration. Without DNA samples from the actual colonists, which don't exist, it's nearly impossible to draw a direct line of connection. Even if similarities are found, they can't be traced with certainty to the Roanoke group rather than later European settlers. So while DNA and other scientific evidence haven't provided a definitive answer, they haven't closed the door either. Instead, they have added support to the idea that at least some of the settlers may have survived, merged with local tribes, and started new lives outside of English control or knowledge. Taken together, the historical accounts, oral traditions, and scientific research all seem to point in a similar direction. They suggest a story of survival rather than extinction, a slow transformation rather than a single dramatic ending. If the settlers did disperse and become part of native communities, their disappearance wasn't really a disappearance at all. It was a shift, a blending, a quiet continuation that history's official records failed to capture. For centuries, the disappearance of the Roanoke colony has inspired debate, imagination, and countless attempts at explanation. Without any direct eyewitness accounts or definitive physical evidence, it has remained one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in early American history. But even if there's no single smoking gun, the available evidence, gathered from archaeology, oral tradition, historical writings, and science, has allowed researchers to form several well-supported theories. One of the most widely accepted ideas is that the settlers joined or were taken in by local Native American tribes, most notably the CROATOANs. This theory is largely built around the word CROATOAN, carved into a post at the abandoned Roanoke site, and the fact that no signs of violence or sudden departure were ever found. When John White returned to find the colony gone, he noted that the area hadn't been attacked or burned. The homes and fort had been carefully dismantled, not destroyed, and no graves or human remains were discovered nearby. That suggests that whatever happened was done with some degree of order. The CROATOANs were one of the few tribes in the region known to have had relatively peaceful relations with the English. Previous visits to the area, including by White himself, had shown the CROATOANs to be cooperative, and some had even acted as guides and intermediaries. If the settlers were struggling for food, shelter, or safety, especially during a time of drought, it would have made sense for them to seek out help from a friendly group. The possibility that they integrated into CROATOAN society is supported by later reports of native people in the region having European features, speaking broken English, or following customs that seemed influenced by European traditions. Another possibility is that not all of the settlers went to CROATOAN Island. Some may have moved further inland. This theory gained attention following the discovery of European artifacts at inland sites such as those in Bertie County, North Carolina. The artifacts, which included pieces of pottery, tools, and even weapons, matched the time period of the Roanoke settlers and were found in locations far from the coast. These items weren't just lying on the surface, they were discovered in layers alongside Native American objects, suggesting a shared or mixed occupation of the area. There's also the map clue found in the British Museum, a small fort symbol hidden under a patch on one of John White's original maps of the region. This raised the idea that the colonists had a backup plan, or perhaps that White had knowledge of an intended inland destination. Although the inland theory is harder to confirm due to the broad area involved in the passage of time, the discovery of European goods in remote villages supports the idea that some settlers may have moved away from the coast in search of more hospitable land. A third theory, once popular among some historians, is that the settlers were killed by hostile native tribes. This idea is based on the known tensions between English colonists and several indigenous groups in the region. While the CROATOANs were generally friendly, others like the CROATOAN had more strained relationships with the English due to previous conflicts. The possibility of an attack, especially if the settlers were seen as a threat or had taken resources, can't be completely ruled out. However, the lack of physical evidence to support this theory is significant. There are no signs of mass graves, no weapons left behind, and no destruction consistent with a large-scale attack. While violence could have occurred in isolated incidents or against smaller groups, there's little to suggest that the entire colony was wiped out by conflict. That makes the attack theory less convincing when compared to others that are supported by physical and cultural clues. Some have also speculated that the settlers may have fallen victim to pirates or even Spanish forces. At the time, England and Spain were fierce rivals, and there were skirmishes between them throughout the Atlantic and the Americas. Spain had a strong presence in Florida, and some historians once theorized that Spanish forces may have discovered the English outpost and destroyed it. Pirates were also known to operate in the region, and some have suggested that they could have attacked the colony in search of supplies or as part of broader hostilities between European powers. But like the hostile tribe theory, this idea lacks supporting evidence. There are no Spanish records indicating that an attack was carried out at Roanoke, and no pirate-related artifacts have ever been discovered there. If a military raid or pirate assault had occurred, we would expect to see more destruction or signs of struggle, which simply aren't present at the site. After reviewing all of these theories, many researchers and historians believe that the most likely explanation is not a single traumatic event, but a gradual, practical response to worsening conditions. The settlers arrived underprepared for the challenges of the New World. The land was unfamiliar, the weather was harsh, and they lacked sufficient supplies. When their governor, John White, returned to England, they may have waited for a time, but it's unlikely they would have sat idle for years, especially if their survival was at stake. The drought recorded in the tree ring studies adds another layer to this understanding. With crops failing and freshwater sources drying up, the settlers were probably forced to act. Some may have gone to CROATOAN Island, where help from the CROATOANs could have kept them alive. Others may have chosen to venture inland, where rivers, game, and possibly friendlier tribes offered better chances of long-term survival. It's also possible that some tried both approaches, splitting into smaller groups to improve their chances. This would explain why no single site has provided conclusive answers. The settlers may have dispersed so widely and blended so fully into local cultures that no distinct colony or grave site remains. Over time, as they married into tribes, adopted new ways of life, and raised children, their English identity may have faded. What began as an English colony became something else, part of a shared history with native communities, rather than a separate or dominant one. While some questions will likely remain unanswered, the growing consensus is that the Roanoke settlers didn't just disappear. They adapted. They merged into the landscape and into local societies, and in doing so, they slipped out of the official history books but continued on in other forms, through stories, bloodlines, and bits of pottery buried in the earth. And this kind of ending may not be as dramatic as being attacked by pirates or wiped out by war, but it is arguably more human. It reflects resilience and practicality. The settlers were people faced with impossible choices. Rather than perish or wait helplessly, they acted. They found ways to live, even if it meant giving up the colony they came to build. What makes the mystery of Roanoke so compelling is not just that a group of people went missing, but that they left behind a story open to interpretation. It reminds us how complex history can be, how easily stories can be lost or misunderstood, and how sometimes survival takes forms we don't expect. The legacy of the Lost Colony isn't just in the word CROATOAN carved on a post. It's in the questions that word has raised for over 400 years, and in the ongoing search for answers that blend archaeology, storytelling, and science. It's in the descendants who still carry names linked to the settlers, and in the oral traditions that quietly preserve a forgotten chapter of cooperation and survival. The most likely conclusion is not that the Roanoke settlers vanished without a trace, but that their story was never truly lost, just hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to listen. So, what do you think happened to the settlers of Roanoke? Did they live on, quietly blending into new communities? Or is there still more we've yet to uncover? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe for more history stories just like this one.